Hello. Today I'd like to talk about Lightroom. And in talking about Lightroom, what I want to cover is the basic panel, what we see right here on the right-hand side. Just the very basics. Because when we bring photographs into Lightroom, one of the very first things we want to do is correct those things that we find in our photo because it's in a raw format. A raw format isn't quite focused enough, doesn't have the right light features in it that we want, and it doesn't have the right color or color balance. So because of that, we have all this data in our photograph because we shot in RAW, and we use Lightroom to bring it to its basic form so we can add artistic effects to it and finish up our processing. So today what I want to cover is all going to be on the right side of Lightroom, and we're going to start with the histogram, and then we're going to skip over our masking. That's a topic for another day. And we're going to talk about the basic panel. If you don't see your basic panel, it could be that it's turned down and you click the little arrow, and that brings the basic panel in view. Now let me give you another hint. If you use Lightroom and you have a habit of having more than one panel open at one time, you know you could end up scrolling a lot. So what you can do is that you can hold your Control key down and click on one of the panels in between and choose solo mode. When you choose solo mode, it will only allow one panel to be open at one time. When you click open a second one, it closes up the one that you were working on prior. So it gives you more room and keeps everything a little more tidy. Alright, so let's start with our histogram. This is probably one of the most important parts of Lightroom when we're analyzing our photos and making changes to our photos, especially when it comes to light and color. Basically, the histogram is giving us a visual representation of light and color that is in our photograph. So if we look at the photograph here in the center, you can see that because everything is shifted over to the left, it's dark. And we can see we have a lot of dark in here with just a little bit of light. But when we look at our histogram, at the very far left, and you can see it lights up when we hover over it, these are our blacks. The next area that we light up as we move across, these are our shadows. The middle is our midtones. We hover over one more section. These are our highlights. And over to the far right, these are our whites. And what we want to do is balance this photograph with the histogram by use of the basic panel. Now, one other thing about the histogram, you have two arrows here, and these are areas that are going to point to your photograph, right on your photograph, where you're blocking shadows or you're blowing out highlights. So you can see I'm hovering over that little arrow now, and we see red in the center of the picture. That means that that area is blown out. There's no color and there's no detail. So we'd have to bring that back in if we wanted to have any color or detail in that part of the photo. Over on the left, you can see there's some areas of blue, and that is areas where shadows are totally blocked, meaning it's totally black, there's no color, and there's no detail. So we'd like to try to recover those if we could. Other things you can do with the histogram, if you hover over that certain area, you can see my icon turns into a cursor. If you hold your mouse button down and drag, you can drag and open up those areas. So here we're on our blacks. So I'm lightening up our blacks. If I go to the very middle, these are our midtones. I can hold my mouse button down and drag back and forth, and I affect only the midtones of my photograph. If I want to tone down my highlights, I come over here to the highlights area, hold my mouse button down, and drag. This is just another way to make changes the same way we would in the basic panel down below. And you can see we've made changes to the histogram, and it's changed some of our sliders here. Right? So let's hit reset and bring it right back to the beginning and kind of go over what we find in our basic panel. And we'll be referring back and forth to the histogram as we make our changes in the basic panel. The first thing we see is treatment, and this is a very basic one. Are we treating this as a color photograph, or are we going to try this in black and white and try to process it that way? 99% of the time, we're probably going to hang out in this color treatment area. The next thing we want to cover is profiles. Now, Profiles is kind of an advanced topic, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But what a profile is a set of commands or an instruction set that process a photo in a certain way. They've actually become more powerful with the new masking features that can be set up in profiles. But think of a profile as a way to process a raw file automatically the same way every single time. So if you process landscapes, fall landscapes the same way every single time, and then tweak it from there, it allows you to speed up your processing if you have, a lot of files to go through. This only applies to raw files. You can't apply presets to a JPEG. All right. So it comes with some basic profiles. Adobe Color is what I leave mine at, unless I'm using what's called a camera profile. So there is a profile for every specific camera that launches you in RAW mode where everything is pretty much centered out. So it gives you more latitude or more dynamic processing you can do when the profile is set to your specific camera. But just to show you as an example, these are what come with Adobe Lightroom. You can choose like Adobe Standard. You can see it's a little less contrast. Adobe Monochrome turns it black and white. You can also purchase presets from other photographers. That's how they make some extra money. They create their own presets, bundle them in a batch, and sell them. So here are some presets that I've purchased, like from Matt Glaskowski. So you could click on Bleached here, you get this look, or Crisp and Warm. Dreamy is another one that I like, or Sunrise Glow. But just a way for you to apply a bunch of effects all at one time. So let's close out of this and change our Sunrise Glow back to where we were started in Adobe Color. So as far as using this, it's kind of an advanced technique. It's probably better to learn how to do all these changes before you go off and buy presets and try to do something, make changes to your photograph that you're not familiar with. It's better just to know what everything does in the preset before using presets. The next, what we see down here is what we call white balance. And white balance is where we control the temperature and tint of the photograph. So all you have to do is grab the slider. If you want to make it warmer, you slide it to the right. If you want to make it cooler, you slide it to the left. Anytime that you make a change in any of these sliders, if you don't like the change and you can't remember exactly where you started, if you just double click on the header, it'll take it right back to center. You can also do the same thing by putting your cursor on the little dot itself and double clicking. It'll take it right back to center to where it was when you started working. So as you can see, as we move the slider, you get a value that changes here, and you'll hear some people talking about changing the temperature value of the photograph. This is what they're talking about, and it's based in Kelvin, so this would be 7101 Kelvin. Let's take our temperature back to where it was. Tint is magenta and green changes, and this is just how you would make changes in temp. You also have a little eyedropper here, is what I call it, and if you click on it, you can grab that, and what you're supposed to do with it is put it on a neutral color in your photograph. And I really don't have any in here. The closest I have is the white here in this little waterfall. And you click on that neutral color, and Adobe will try to analyze the photograph and put it at what it thinks is the proper white balance. Might be a good place to start if you have a white balance really out of whack. Otherwise, I say just grab the slider and move it to what you think it should be when you took the picture. Alright, the next area we're going to cover is the tone block. And the tone block primarily is concerned with luminance, brightness, contrast, highlights and shadows, whites and blacks. To make things very simple, Adobe has given us a little button here called Auto, and if we click on Auto, it will make all these adjustments for us using AI. So let's go ahead and click on it, and you can see that very little change in exposure and contrast, and it's widened up our highlights and shadows and made a few changes to our whites and blacks. And if we look at the photo, it doesn't look too bad. Right? If we look before, using our backslash key, we can see before, hit the backslash key again, we can see after, before and after. So it did a pretty good job. But we want to learn how this happens, so we're not going to really rely on this auto button right now. If you want to change everything back to the way it was, all you have to do is double click on the tone tab, the tone word, and it will center everything back to the way it was when we first started. So our first slider is exposure, and exposure is brightness. Some people do call it a brightness slider. If we slide it to the left, we get dark. If we slide it to the right, we get bright. Right? So what we're trying to find is a happy medium between just the right amount of light and too much light without blowing out any areas. Adobe also gives us a key to help us with this, and that's the J key. So let's press the J key now, and we can see any areas that are blown out are highlights, and any areas that are shadows are being blocked. Now what we want to do is move this exposure slider to where we get the least amount of blowouts without making everything too dark. Realizing that we have other tools to help get rid of this blowout, and we'll get to those a little later on. Alright, so we have our exposure about right where we want, so it's at 0.65. Next is contrast, and for lack of a better word, all contrast does is makes whiter white and blacker is blacker, or black's blacker. Yeah, there you go. So as we move to the left, you can see it reduces the white and black contrast. We get a very flat, matte looking picture. If we move it to the right, it starts bringing up the highlights and bringing up the darks, which then darkens the picture, increases the blowouts, increases the shadows. I really don't find much use for the contrast slider. There's other tools that can give us better ranges and targeted adjustments for contrast. So very seldom do I adjust this very much. So we're just going to leave it right here about +4. The next is highlights. And highlights are represented on your histogram in this zone right here. So if we hover in this zone, you can see it light up with our highlights. If I hold our mouse button down and drag while we're in the highlights, it will adjust the highlights in view for us. All right? So that's one way to adjust highlights. The other way, of course, is just to grab the little button here and slide it back and forth. And what we're doing is trying to reduce the highlights so we don't have any red, any blowout in our photograph. So that looks pretty good right there. The next is shadows. Shadows is represented in the histogram in this area. And like highlights, we can hold our mouse button down and we can drag left and right to increase or decrease our shadows. And what we're doing is that we're trying to increase our shadows without causing any blowouts and to try to free up these blocked areas. Now this is a woodland scene. I like shadows in woodland, so I'm not going to get real excited about trying to pick those out. Everything looks pretty good right now. And if you look at our histogram, we're starting to get a good histogram, which is little or no peaks in the shadows and little or no peaks in the highlights. Now we can see we have a big peak here in our highlights, and there's really not much we can do about that because of the way the scene was shot. All right. You can also, when you're looking at your histogram, you can click on these buttons and it will show up the like the J key, it will show highlights and blowouts. The J key turns those off. So J key turns them on, J key turns them off. When the J key is off, if you just want to see highlights, you can click the highlight tab. If you just want to see blowouts, you can click the shadows tab. All right, so we've looked at our highlights, we've looked at our shadows, and now we want to set a good white point and black point. Your white point will be this little area at the back end of your histogram. Your black point is on the front end of the histogram. Again, Adobe gives us some shortcuts, some helper tools to determine our black point and white point, and that's using the alternate or option key on a Mac. You hold that down and you click on your slider and slide it left and right. What you want to do is try to keep it as a black screen with very little white shining through. All right, so that's a good white point. Black point, we want to click on it when we get a white screen, and we want to move our slider till we have little or no black and yellow areas. So I'm going to take our black point right there. So now we've set our exposure. We can see that our histogram is getting the peak near the center, which is good. We set our contrast, which is the difference in our white and black points. Highlights, this area right up here, highlights along with other areas like this. Shadows are dark areas in the photograph. Whites is the white point of our brights, and blacks are the dark points of our shadows. Alright, now that we have our white balance under control and the basic tone settings so we have a good view of our picture, let's now start talking about presence, which is texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. I think these settings are probably one of the more popular settings in the basic panel, but I also think they're the most misunderstood settings in the basic panel. So I just want to go into a little more detail with these 5 settings than we did kind of up here in tone. So one thing that I want to explain is when we start talking about especially texture and clarity and to a certain extent vibrance and saturation, is that we have 2 different areas that we can affect an object. One is by frequency, and you'll hear us say low, medium, or high frequency. And when we talk about frequency, we're talking about edge detail. So an area that has a lot of edges, like in these leaves or down here in the tree trunk and the leaves, that's a high frequency area. Areas like along these rocks, they have some edges, but nowhere near the edges that you find in leaves. This would be a low frequency area. I'm sorry, a mid frequency area. And then areas right here where you have very few edges and have a smooth looking area, this would be a low frequency area. So like for an example, when we talk about texture, texture was made for mid frequency areas. All right. We're also going to talk about tone quality. And we've already talked about that. We have low, medium, and high. All right, so our tone can be low for darks, medium is the broad range between low and high, and then high tone or our brightness. It would be the brightest area of a picture, because that comes into play when we talk about vibrance and saturation. So our first slider is texture. And texture, oddly enough, was originally made as a smoothing tool. It was used for skin smoothing, still is, but that was the main use of it in the beginning. In fact, if we go to another picture here and we zoom in, texture only attacks or only affects mid-frequency areas. So here we have high frequency area, here we have, this is in mid, but skin tones are what it was supposed to be used for. So if we grab our texture slider and start moving it over, you can see how we're smoothing out the skin on the face. It went a little too heavy there. But we're affecting the skin, but we're not affecting anything else around it. And that's because the texture slider is for mid-frequency changes. Now, of course, if we crank it down all the way, we're going to start seeing some effect in the other frequency, the high frequency areas and mid-frequency and low. But for the most part, a good application of it will be a good smoothing action. If we take it up to the opposite way, which it was never intended to be used, again, you see we're still affecting the mid-frequency area, and we're not really hitting these other areas. See, as I move here, it doesn't affect anything as much as the skin. So this is just a good example. When we say texture, we're going to be affecting areas that are in mid-frequency range. All right. So let's go back to our picture in the woods. And I'm going to be zoomed in here on this because I want to show you the effects of texture on the different areas. So we're just going to crank it up full bore all the way. Now remember, when we crank anything up full bore, it's going to go beyond. Like I said, it's only supposed to affect mid-frequency areas. It's going to spill over into areas because we've sent it all the way off the scale. But it gives you a good idea of what's going on. So when we move texture all the way up to 100, our mid areas around here, they're coming into focus. They have good contrast edges. They look really good. our water still retains its smooth effect because we really didn't hit it that hard. See, we made these changes. All right, we're getting good effect in these mid and high frequency areas, but our low frequency area is not being affected near as much. More importantly, we're not affecting the luminance, the illumination, the brightness of this area, and we're not affecting the color. That's one of the strong points of the texture slider. We can make changes to our contrast edging, make things look sharper in a certain range type of objects, and not affect our luminance. All right, let's center this up, and now let's talk about clarity. Clarity, if texture is a paintbrush, clarity is a hammer. Right? Clarity does not care about frequency. All it cares about is midtone. Clarity likes to hit the midtones very hard. So when we look at this area right here in our histogram, we can see midtones covers a lot of area. This is the area clarity is going to hit the hardest. More importantly, to its detriment, clarity also affects luminance and affects saturation. So as you crank up clarity, you're going to get better edge contrast or sharpening, but you're also going to introduce luminance, make the objects brighter, and you're going to decrease their saturation. So if we look at our clarity slider here, and we're going to crank this one up just like we did the texture, and you'll see. All right, our luminance has increased. We have lost saturation. See how this is faded and the greens are less green. And it's affected everything. All right, everything has been affected. So if we also turn it down, we can see the same thing. We've affected our luminance, we've affected our saturation, and we've affected the contrast edging of everything. So there is a purpose for clarity. I think it's better used very slightly and brushed on using a mask brush and brushing at just the areas that you're looking for. So I would just want to show you the difference. We're going to crank texture up. Here's what we see in texture. Here's what we see in clarity. Big difference. So some people think they're kind of the same thing, but they're really not. They're totally different tools. And what the big difference is, here's cranking up texture. Our luminance is maintained. Our saturation is maintained. Clarity, we do get some good edging and simulated focus, but we also introduce luminance and we also desaturate the area. So that's the main difference between texture and clarity. Dehaze is kind of a cross between the both of them. It has good uses on foggy scenes or hazy scenes when you're shooting off in the distance. It does affect luminance, and it does affect a color hue. So it can change colors. If we crank this up, you can see we're introducing a blue hue to our greens. We're also darkening it because it's applying a lot of contrast. It does have good effects when you have a scene from a mountain view, let's say, that has a haze because you've shot so far away or because there's slight fog. You can reduce that with the dehaze slider. Here I've pulled up a picture of the southern Oregon coast so I can just show you a little bit what the dehaze feature was meant for. So here we have a scene of the coastline, and because far off in the distance we just have atmospheric haze, we can get rid of some of that with the dehaze slider. So we'll grab the dehaze slider and start sliding it to the right to decrease the haze. Now we can go only so far before you see we start affecting the color and hue of our sky and the color and hue of the water. So it's like a real delicate dance to find what is good and what is bad when you start using the dehaze slider. Now of course you can combine that with, we'll change the temperature of the picture a little bit, add a little warmth to it, take some of that blue out. You can play with the shadows and highlights, maybe add a little contrast from this slider here. And you can see if we look at our before and after, that it did make a good change in getting rid of some of that haze, but then we're going to be left with maybe some color corrections too. So it really has some good features to attack some of this atmospheric condition. I wouldn't really use it for fog, because fog is an atmosphere we want in the picture, so we probably wouldn't want to reduce that. But it's good in getting rid of some of this nasty haze that we find on warm summer days when we're shooting off in the distance. Here we have a picture of sunflowers. We're still talking about dehaze. Dehaze does have some constructive uses in that if you wanted to put a halo or a glow around an object, you can use opposite of dehaze and start cranking it down. And you can see that you'll get a good effect of a glow, a sun glow around the object that you want to use. So dehaze can be used either way, to clear up haze off of far off subjects or a little bit of fog. It can also be used in the opposite direction to create a haze or a glow around your subject. Alright, the last area we want to cover is vibrance and saturation. And like texture and clarity, a lot of people assume that these are the same thing or work about the same way, and they really don't know there is a huge difference in the two and how you should use them. We'll start out with using vibrance. Now, vibrance was made to only affect mid-tone colors. So this range right here is the area that it will attack first. Of course, if you crank it all the way up, it's going to start affecting a lot more other things. But use moderately, and it's only going to affect mid-tone colors. And more importantly is that vibrance does not attack skin color right away. So you can make changes to color around a person and it won't affect the skin color. So let's take a look at a little buffalo farmer here that I met out in Kansas, and we'll just start cranking up the vibrance. So you can see we're up to about 50% here. We're increasing the vibrance in his jeans and his shirt and the greens and the trees, but we really haven't affected the color of his skin. Now if we go a little higher, of course we're going to start attacking the skin or affecting the skin as we get up near 100. But again, it's really attacking the colors around them. All right, the midtones of his skin color is not really being affected as much as saturation will affect. So now let's look at saturation. Saturation affects all colors, regardless of what tone they are. And it attacks them all at the same time, all at the same level. So when we make changes with saturation, let's go up to 40% like we did on our vibrance. And you can see we have affected the skin. He's starting to get that Oompa Loompa look. We've affected the color of his shirt. We've affected the trees. And if we go all the way like we did with vibrance, we only had a moderate change in his skin and vibrance. But here you can see we're definitely into Oompa Loompa territory along with the changes in all the other colors. So that's the primary difference between saturation and vibrance. Now saturation also will increase luminance when you increase the saturation. All right, so let me pull up another picture and we can look at that. So look at this sunset from Nova Scotia. And you can see it already got good color in it, but we have the sun sitting off right here. Now if I crank up the vibrance, we're going to get more color in the sunset. Now we're real high. We're at 60 points right here. But we really haven't got crazy colors going on. And we haven't affected the luminance of the sun. It has stayed the same. So let's double click here and bring vibrance back down. And now let's take saturation up the same way to 60. Now we've gone like nuclear here. So the sun has gotten brighter. The sunset has gotten oranger. We've gotten a little more purple hue up at the top here. And that's not what we want. We just want to increase the sunset colors without increasing the luminance of the sun. So you can see that saturation is not our friend in this type of picture. We'll go back to our vibrance. Now we'll go up to the same level. We'll go up to 65, I think is what we were at. So again, you can see before, after, before, after. We have good color change. We're not increasing our luminance, and everything looks more natural. Center this, and we'll go back to vibrance. We'll take this up to 60. And you can see we've increased the luminance of the sun, which is not what we wanted. We've got some colors in here that are getting into the unreal territory. So here's before, after, before, after. So the big thing to remember about the difference in saturation and vibrance, vibrance is geared more towards mid-tone pixels. It doesn't increase luminance, so it won't get brighter. And it won't affect skin color to a certain level. So if you're trying to adjust color on a portrait, you're better suited to use vibrance than saturation. Saturation, again, affects all pixels regardless of tone, high, medium, or low, and it does increase saturation, and it will start making a shift in hue if you start getting really high in that. Well, I hope this little session on the basic panel helped out. I know it's kind of long, 30 minutes. There's a lot to go over, and I tried to go over as soon as I could. If anybody has any questions, don't be afraid to send me an email or give me a call. I'll be glad to help you out. And just to let you see, just using the basic panel, this is what we ended up with this picture. Here's the before, here's the after, here's the before, here's the after. Just with using the basic panel, you can get great results with your pictures using Lightroom. I'll talk to you guys later.